Welcome. You're with the Economic Times, and my name is Ashutosh Sinha. I welcome you all to the Economic Times Sophos presents Enhance the Digital Supply Chain Security Roundtable. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be talking a lot about some of the issues around this. I don't quite need to emphasize the need or the importance of the subject. Still, let me try and put a little context to it, because these are the times for ransomware, cyber attacks, disruption, denial of services. So if you've been following some of the recent developments around the issue, I just mentioned one thing is staring businesses in the face, everyone. And that includes buyers, suppliers, businesses, whether they are large or small, users of products and services. When a supply chain is compromised, everyone gets impacted. Add essential services as well as government services to that, and that complexity that we're talking of shoots up several notches. It is as clear as daylight that the pace and the magnitude of these disruptions and attacks are increasing. It is clear that supply chain security needs strong oversight, should I say, oversight at the senior-most levels in the company, and, well, security that comes along with it. Risk to security in the supply chain can be varied, from physical threats to cyber attacks, including mitigating risks that come with industry partnerships. What a changed world we are in today. To effectively approach supply chain security, it will take a multifaceted, coordinated approach to ensure that things are in control. So as global businesses talk about digitally driven supply chain, some of these challenges could get even bigger. As organizations scale, the risks that supply chain face is only enhanced. It must also balance large and complex global networks alongside staff and budget constraints. So these are some of the attendant problems. And, well, we're not even talking of unforeseen disruptions. At the same time, there is an overarching demand from governments, customers, employees for increased transparency and visibility into the supply chain. With more and more external facing touch points that the supply chains are exposed to, the opportunity for increased risk needs to be assessed, managed, and addressed. And we're going to be talking about some of these with a very stellar group of people. We have, let me introduce them and let me welcome everyone. We have Ms. Sakshi Vidur, Director Enterprise IT Security at Philips. Mayur Danait, he is CIO at Pidilite. Kapil Mehrotra, Group Chief Technical Officer at National Collateral Management Services. Munjal Kamdar, he's partner at Deloitte India. And John Shier, he's Senior Security Advisor at Sophos. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. May I first request John to take over and go through a welcome address and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Ashutosh, and thank you everyone for attending, and welcome to my co-panelists as well. So as Ashutosh mentioned in his introduction, we're going to be talking about some supply chain security and some of the attendant things that come along with the insecurity of the supply chain. Supply chain insecurity and supply chain compromises of the traditional sense, that is, distribution, if you think of it in traditional terms, goods not getting to their destinations, is something that's been around for a long time, but it's also something that has gained the attention of cyber criminals and cyber crime. And when we talk about supply chain security in this context, we're talking about the systems and the services that are reliant and interconnected to each other, and how those get disrupted by these criminal actors. And very often, and one of the things that will come up in this discussion, is the end goal of the supply chain compromise is very often something like ransomware. It's actually an additional threat that gets imposed onto that victim. We started seeing these kinds of activities some years ago with, if you recall, NotPetya, which was due to a supply chain attack leveraging another victim in this case, which was a small accounting software company in Ukraine. And of late, it seems like the pace of some of these supply chain compromise attacks has been picking up. And I think the reason some of it is becoming more prevalent is because the systems are just so increasingly interdependent on one another. So that means that a disruption to one system or one piece of software or one service can have disruption across many different interconnected systems and services. And because of all the ways that we share and communicate data, that can have a massive impact. So lately, we've seen things like the Solar Wind Sunburst campaign that was a major supply chain compromise. We also saw the Excellion file transfer agent attacks, which resulted in the Clop ransomware gang gaining access to some very large companies and stealing a lot of data. The Kaseya attacks, well, that's an interesting one because immediately a lot of people called that a supply chain attack. However, the attack against Kaseya was leveraging a vulnerability. That was an exploit against Kaseya. However, Kaseya was then used as the intermediary to attack a bunch of their customers in a supply chain attack. And while most of these were indeed, the result of most of these was indeed ransomware, we've also seen some that also disrupted the traditional supply chain. So the Colonial Pipeline attack, which shut down a lot of the United States gasoline pipelines earlier this year, and the JBS meatpacking attack as well, which also shut down the meatpacking supply chain for a lot of the world. So as we can see, all these things are very much interconnected. They're things that cyber criminals they're tools that they're leveraging really against us, against our businesses, in order to increase the likelihood of the payment of ransomware. On the topic of ransomware, we're seeing some interesting and somewhat disturbing figures across the world. The ransomware incidents have actually gone down a little bit, but payment is going up, and really more importantly, the cost to recovery is going up. So it's more than doubled since last year, and in India specifically, it's actually quadrupled over last year. So with those things in mind, and the fact that it's more about quality, not quantity of ransomware attacks, the attackers right now are getting into the network. They're breaching far deeper and wider than they have ever before. They're stealing all of your data, and they're adding different layers of extortion. They're adding layers of double and triple layers of extortion in order to pressure the businesses to pay, which incidentally takes all of our data as well. So if it's HR data or financial data, and puts that at risk. So there's a personal risk for your company being attacked, as well as the financial and reputational risk that companies face. So with that, I will turn it over to Munjal to give you a little bit more context around the discussion today.
Oh, before Munjal speaks, let me just put a little context, because what Munjal, and with the context that he said, he has a very interesting study of about 1,200 companies. Munjal, I'm all waiting to hear that from you and the details that you'll share.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Ashutosh. And welcome to all the participants. It's great to be speaking today with my co-panelists. So I'll do some amount of context setting in the supply chain issue, right? The first is, if you take a step back, if you speak to any CEO, right, any CXO for that matter, and what's the overwhelming business priority, right? They'll tell you it's two things. One is growth, and the second is growth with profitability, right? So these are the two main business objectives that you would find across companies. One of the levers that most CXOs are leveraging to achieve these business objectives, right, is to outsource everything that they can outsource, right? So that you focus on the core activities that you need to perform as an organization, right? So you hear about, telecom companies only owning the brand and outsourcing everything, or an Uber not owning any cars at all, right, in the first place. So what does this point to? A very large reliance being placed on the supply chain, right? So that's where the context for the emphasis on supply chain security is coming in. Now, notwithstanding the pandemic, right? Enterprises today are embracing digital transformation as never before. Yes, it's got accelerated after the pandemic struck last year. Now, in a fast-moving business environment, companies make necessary IT changes on the fly, with security waivers, risk acceptance being a common feature. This causes cyber attackers and corporate spies to have a field day, right? They're capitalizing on this disruption, meeting in virtual rooms to engage in advanced persistent mapping of enterprise IT environments and associated vulnerabilities. And this includes the area and the environment that are reliant on third-party support. John spoke about the Sunburst attack, and that proved that enterprise environments and third-party capabilities are interpenetrated and they are indistinguishable for any organization. Now, the organizations face a dilemma. My sympathies with the CIOs and the CISOs, because they need to do two things which seem to be contradictory in nature, right? One is, in order to ensure cooperation while providing sufficient cooperation for protection to all sides, they must bring third parties into the inner circle of the security perimeters, because the dependence is very large on third parties. Now, at the same time, they are also being told to scrutinize third parties more intensively, right? On the surface, these two mandates are counterposed, right? But must they be? The short answer is no, right? The two stances, trust and scrutiny, do not have to be in opposition. In fact, they are more effective when they are contained in a reciprocal relationship. The report that Ashutosh referred to, right, the 1200, the survey that we conducted of 1200 global organizations and the reliance on third-party security, as well as the security fallout that they see from this, pointed out to 4 key trends. And hopefully we'll discuss more about this as the discussion goes on, right? They basically tie into multiple areas. The first is, many organizations are just collecting their thoughts and are in a response phase as far as the pandemic is concerned, right? The second is, automation and risk intelligence is a key funding priority. Third, digital risks are a top concern. Now, given the background on the rapid digitalization, this is no surprise. And finally, fourth, cost pressures are preventing insourcing. So even the organizations may look back and say, look, I want to bring this activity back into my organization. They are unable to do it because of the cost pressures. It's always more effective and cheaper to outsource. So organizations need to get this around their head that, look, I need to outsource and outsource with risks being monitored and handled. Not outsourcing is not the option. I hope that gives some amount of context setting, Ashutosh, and we can get into more details as we go forward. So back to you.
Okay. So some details of that 1,200 companies, the global survey. If you can share maybe a couple of, since you just mentioned them in 4 points, could you just share a little more details there, Munjal? Because that will beautifully set it up also for Sakshi to come in.
Sure. So let me get into some more details, right? Firstly, I spoke about, many organizations are still responding to the pandemic. So what we discovered in this survey, right, is that about 74% of the organizations said that they were either in the respond or the recovery phase. Typically, when we look at the coming out of the pandemic impact, we call it the thrive phase, right? So 3/4 of the organizations are still responding or recovering, right? Trying to get around what we need to do here, right? Now, out of this, half the organizations have also told us that they need to make major investments to re-energize their third-party risk management programs. The pandemic has turned it over topsy-turvy, right? They've had supply chain disruptions. Some of the vendors have continued to support them. Some are unable to. Some have got disruptions in terms of supply of spare parts or their own people, so on and so forth. So at least half of them, half of the respondents have said they need to make substantial investment in their third-party programs, risk management programs, right, to get a better view of the risks that they face. And the third part that I would focus on is that when we look at the spectrum of risks being faced, right, cyber security, IT security continue to be the top issues that they face. However, in complement to that, they've also outlined newer risks such as health and safety risk, resiliency, right, concentration risk, geopolitical, as well as contractual. So these are some of the other areas that are giving them additional dimensions outside of cyber and IT security.
Correct.
And one area is also that if we looked at if we scratch the surface and look at it in more detail, one of the domains in which organizations would like to have better inputs, right, is real-time information, risk metrics, and reporting on the business processes, which also pointed to the fact that they need to make better and more thought-through investments in tools and technology. Because given the large vendor base, I mean, if you talk about large or global organizations, I mean, for example, Philips is one of them, right? I mean, I don't know the exact number at Philips, maybe Sakshi knows better, but I would guess that it's in the range of maybe 30, 40, 50,000 third parties. that Philips works with globally. There's no way you can manage all of them, right, without having the right tools and technology in place. So that is some of the areas where they would like to invest.
Sure. So, Sakshi, since he's mentioned, and I was thinking of tossing it to you, managing the enterprise managing the enterprise security for a brand or a global brand, let's just call it a global brand for now. What does it tell you about the change in atmosphere? Because this is where you hear from companies saying that, well, a lot has changed, particularly in the last year or two, the pandemic, post-pandemic period.
No, absolutely right, Ashutosh. I'd like to start by saying that I will only share my personal views over this kind of, discussion. And these are totally my personal views and not of my companies. And I think the difficulties that have been already shared by Munjal, it's absolutely bang on in terms of, it's a battle for digital security today. And these difficulties, they require the governance as well as collaboration between the supply chain and the IT function. So that's the change that's coming in. We need to supply chain is at the forefront of managing, the risks that are inherent to becoming a digital business today, which is the priority for most of the companies today. And one of the largest risks right now, is the security risk to the information components of the supply chain. So I feel like, organizing the change that we are seeing is that, the organizations must employ a multifaceted risk mitigation. And I'll talk about the top two areas in this area. So in this, topic, and the first one being able to centrally manage, the robust remote working solutions that are there, which is, enabling and empowering not just the employees, but the customers and third parties as well. So I feel like, we really need to focus on an integrated digital security approach today, which kind of holistically looks at the IT, the data, the product, the operations related technology all in one. And the second I'd like to say is to ensure IT risk governance and collaboration. And these are required to be able to assess and identify the vulnerable areas. I think the key is to stay abreast on the latest threats and, the success rates of these mitigation techniques. So.
Absolutely. Okay. So since there are so many people who've joined us online, we'd also like to mention that there is a very interesting, we would like your views as well and your questions and answers as well. And let's, okay, let me ask my colleagues to put up a poll for you. And we'd like your views on that before I go to Mayur for the next question. And here's what we are trying to ask. If we can put up that poll and ask you what, we're very much interested in what your view is around that. And that poll is coming up on your screen in just a few seconds there. And that talks about the readiness in the organization on facing the disruption. So that's the poll for you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well is your organization prepared to address supply chain risks, supply chain disruptions rather? And there are four options before you. You can make a choice. Obviously, this is just an indicative number, what will come up, but we'd like your views coming in. So do participate in the polls, and the experts here would love to hear what you think of that. So let me go across and ask Mayur there. Mayur, an iconic brand that you are associated with, and how has the risk profile changed for you? And what, if you can share some details of what your approach to addressing this problem is?
Yeah, thanks, Ashutosh. First of all, pleasure to be here. I think Munjal spoke about the study, and one of the things that I picked up from the study was that even now, now that we are about 18 months into the pandemic, we still have organizations that are responding to the pandemic. I think the statistics said there's 40% of organizations that are still responding to the pandemic. I think one of the approaches that we took very early on, and I would say we took that approach in week 1 of pandemic, is to divide our response team into two groups, which we internally refer to as the Act Now and the Plan Now group. And these two groups, which were headed by members of the leadership team, were essentially given two mandates. The Act Now team was the team that was focused on the here and the now, which is the immediate response to the pandemic from a health perspective, from a remote working perspective, and so on and so forth. And that was the team that was really responding as the lockdowns folded and unfolded. From an IT standpoint, from a cybersecurity standpoint, from an HR standpoint, or supply chain, manufacturing, etc. And then there was a separate group of individuals that was really that we internally called the Plan Now team, which was focused on a slightly longer time frame, which really looked at aspects of the future of work. How are we going to manage it going forward? How does our entire system architecture need to change in order to support this change? What are the opportunities that the pandemic would throw up for an organization like us with its strengths in brands, marketing, supply chain, R&D, etc. So our approach has been really twofold. I agree that it would have been very difficult for one team to kind of focus on and think of the here and now, and also take a strategic lens onto what could be the opportunities that could come out of the pandemic. So that has been one of the things. Specifically from a cybersecurity perspective, I think one of the biggest learnings for us was that while we could very easily transition into a remote working kind of scenario, what we realized is that to a large extent our entire systems have been architected for office work. We have built systems assuming that people would come into work at 9 a.m. in the morning and they would leave at 6 o'clock, and if any, there would be a little bit of work that would happen outside of those defined hours. And with remote work happening, with people using different kinds of devices, logging in from different sorts of networks, and so on and so forth, that entire architecture needed to be changed, and we needed to take a fresh look at that architecture, and that has taken us some time and some effort. Now when we think back, yes, we have to design even our as things as simple as getting the latest antivirus on your laptop, for example, needs to work regardless of where you are, right? It can't work only when you are in the office. So a lot of this stuff has been the areas of focus for us in the past few months.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So from a different perspective, Kapil, Mehrotra, your perspective, because you deal with something that is almost essential. I use the word almost a little carefully there, but can you give us a sense of how difficult can it get when things are not in order for you?
Thank you, Ashutosh, and it's a very relevant topic as per our industry. Looking at the digital market, where everything is moving towards the digital and becomes as a priority. Mm-hmm. If you talk about the manpower, it's basically people are optimizing office spaces, they are optimizing, and the resources, IT resources, they are optimizing, and they are moving towards the remote working. Because now these days, people doesn't want to come back to office post-COVID scenarios. Mm-hmm. Those are really scary because we are running so many applications like SAP, in-house developed lot of applications. They required a lot of architecture change, but those are very time taking. But hackers are taking a lot of advantage of that situation. Reason is because if people are working and they are working from normal Wi-Fi network, where you need a lot of security. Whenever you are in a premise like office premise, you are more secure, but you are working in a home environment where you have only Wi-Fi is the source of point of contact. So there is a lot of issues comes. So so many application has to be re-architected, and looking at the vulnerability type and the vector types they are coming in the market. as John has given the example of colonial pipe supply chain attack and the solar wind, personally I have followed lot of things about that, and what I learned uh, they are little different type of targets they have. If you talk about the solar wind, like where 18,000 customers of solar wind, they have been identified and targeted by the hackers in a one day. Same attack happened to 18,000 people. Just imagine it, right? So these all are the planning is not one day planning. I mean, hackers are targeting supply chain, and we are one of the supply chain company. So we also expect like one day probably such kind of attack can be happened on us. And if you read about the colonial pipe attack, right, wherein like the way they have targeted, it is totally different because it was a history they have created. And US came up with a new digital policy, how we have to secure the digital data. So those was a very good learning for the international community. So like hackers are growing. If you read the solar wind attack and the colonial pipe attacks, they are real examples. And similarly, like in India, like we have a big market because India is moving towards the digital now, and so many mobile applications, so many end users are coming. So looking at that market, we have to basically prepare ourselves before anything happens.
Got it.
Over to you, Ashutosh.
Okay, so the scare, well, scare is probably a wrong word, but the apprehension in the mind, John, is important. Okay, so also let's try and see if we can put up that poll again for you on a scale of 1 to 10. How well is your organization prepared to address supply chain disruptions? You have to make the choice, and your choice will also be a cue, at least for this webinar, for this conversation with the experts, on what the trend is. It's a very small part of the large universe, but it does give you a sense of what that could mean. So I'd expect you to respond to that, and of course those numbers will also come up in a little while from now. So let me toss it to John then, because we're very much speaking on this context, and so we already have some responses coming there. Look at that, 8 to 10. Well, that's okay. We'll wait for more responses. As I can see, quite a few responses already coming in. John, there's a very interesting term used by Sakshi. She said, we need to have an integrated digital security approach. For larger organizations, this definitely makes for a very good approach. Can you give us a sense of the contours of what such an approach could mean and how it can help organizations be more agile, particularly on the security point of view, and to fight against some of these hackers, some of these people?
Sure. So I really like that term, and it's something that as somebody who advises our customers, partners, and just the public at large on how to stay safe within organizations, it's something I talk about. It's the idea of having, and for me, what it means, it's the idea of having the security function of an organization as an overlay across all business functions, not just within the IT group. So for a long time, you had the IT team, and a subset of that team was the security team. They did work for IT, and it was its own silo, and they had their own priorities and their own budgets. Where I think we need to change that mindset, and I think a lot of the larger companies are doing this, is they're taking the IT security team, and in some senses, they're decoupling it from IT itself, overlaying it across the entire organization and saying, okay, finance, what are your priorities and budgets for this year? And how can IT security help you secure your data, secure your business, but do it in a way that's transformative and enabling for your business? And then you move on. HR, okay, it's your turn next. How do we do this in manufacturing and operations and so on and so forth? So that's, to me, that's what integrated means. It's taking the knowledge of the security practitioners within the group and applying it to the different disciplines. Finance they have different requirements and needs than does the operational team, then does the sales team, then does manufacturing. And so understanding what each group's mandate is, what their requirements are, then makes it allows you in sort of Mayur's Plan Now group, it allows them to be able to set the priorities that are specific for that group and then therefore apply better security. But what I think is also important to remember is large organizations can do this fairly easily. And I use that term loosely. They're large, they have big security teams, they have big IT teams. Smaller organizations need to rethink this a little bit and understand, okay, so how do we do that? How do we actually achieve this goal given our smaller resources? So the poll I see has come back up here with so it's encouraging to see that, you know, it looks like the majority, at least over half of the people, think that they are prepared to address a supply chain disruption. What I will challenge the group is, while you think you might be prepared, have you actually tested it? Have you actually done a tabletop exercise to see what happens if one of my supply chain partners, up or down, actually has an outage or actually has a disruption? How does that affect me, or how do I affect them if I have an outage? So I think that it's great to have a plan, but it must be tested. Okay, so it's only the supply or the security is only as good as the weakest link possible in the chain. Munjal, you wanted to make a point. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Ashutosh. Actually, a couple of points, but just a small point to what Kapil said, right? He was right, and he said 18,000 organizations were targeted on a single day on the Sunburst attack. And the background to that is that, we have a term called dwell time, which is the date of compromise and the date of the discovery of the attack. And that period, in the case of Sunburst, was 8 months. It was discovered in December 2020, 8 months after the original compromise happened, right? That was in April 2020. So they had that 8 months to plan the attack, right? Intelligent hackers never exploit as soon as they compromise, right? They wait for the right opportunity, which is what they were doing. So this is a small point on Kapil, but I'd go back to what Mayur said, right? I had a point on that. He spoke about the the plan team and the act now and the plan now team. So I'll tell you our study on the supply chain disruption, right? Covered. I would break it up into two aspects. I would say traditional manufacturing organizations and service organizations, and the manner in which the pandemic has disrupted supply chain for both these is very fascinating. In the case of product-oriented manufacturing organizations, right? You saw issues on the shop floor. Of course, supply is not being there. Therefore, maybe your shop floor stopped and, you could not manufacture cars, or you had some component missing or a chemical missing, so on and so forth. So that is a sort of disruption you saw, along with dependence in terms of concentration risk. So if you're really dependent, on another country or a city that is impacted by COVID, you couldn't get your supplies out from there. In the case of service organizations, so I'm talking about IT companies, IT-enabled companies, I'm talking about banks, right? Financial institutions, which are predominantly service-oriented. The sort of issues we saw there when it came to supply chain was in terms of, you had to scratch beneath the surface. I mean, they never realized the dependence on fourth parties. So you typically looked at the supply chain, the first factor, and said, look, what are the third parties I'm dependent on? Who's my supplier? And the organizations never realized what their suppliers were dependent on, right? So maybe you were outsourcing IT services, and the firm that was providing with manpower was actually dependent on another firm providing them with manpower. And they didn't get manpower from the fourth party, and then the third party couldn't do anything. So the realization also was that you had to scratch beneath the surface and get into, illuminating. We call it supply chain illumination, right? Illuminating aspects of your supply chain which you never saw earlier, which you didn't realize where the risk lay, right? So it went beyond. I mean, the cyber attacks was another part where remote working and access to data from anybody's home was also open to interpretation and open to compromise. So things like that. So the supply chain disruption and the supply chain risk has been very different for different types of organizations.
Okay. So another point, I want to come back to Sakshi and get a sense from her, Sakshi, some of the good practices that a company, a large enterprise would do. And, there was a point raised also about large companies can do that, but can relatively smaller companies afford to do that? I'm sure there are some practices which can be replicated across even smaller companies. Would you like to point some of them out, please?
Sure, Ashutosh. That's a very interesting question, actually. And, there are so many threats right now that There are, of course, many potential tools for security, and there are solutions that are available that can be deployed, understood and deployed, I'd say. So tools that can manage, your cloud security, your DLP, data loss prevention, mobile security, data access governance, vulnerability management, tools around incident response and threat intelligence. And then there's, of course, application security, network security, and endpoint security. So that kind of, is the important, but yeah, big or small organization, I again emphasize on the importance of supply chain to partner with the IT, to understand that which of these tools are being leveraged in the company, how can they be deployed in supply chain operations, especially around IoT capabilities and, operational technology. So I think it's very important to also understand that whether big company or small company, whether the infrastructure is connected to the suppliers' portals, because there should be a plan in place to prevent the impact of your supplier who's getting attacked. So I feel like that kind of again collaboration is important. So irrespective of the size of the company.
Okay, very interesting points. Mayur, how would a company like yours approach this? Because the brand is all around, and the brand, some of those interesting things also happen outside of the, networks of the company. So how does the company itself make sure that, there is no data leakage, there's no, access, unauthorized access given, or something as basic as that as well?
Yeah. So I think if you look at core cybersecurity strategy, then our strategy has always been really twofold. One is to keep the good stuff in, and the other part is, of course, to keep the bad stuff out. Now, unfortunately, as things have unfolded over the last few weeks, months, and maybe even years, is the amount of good stuff that you have to keep in has kept ballooning. Business keeps expanding. There is more brands, more products. You reach more geographies, etc. So your perimeter for the good stuff keeps on expanding. At the same time, the bad stuff is going up as well. So there is more and more threat vectors that you see. You spoke about a few of them. There is denial of services, there's ransomware, there is malware, there is phishing, and so on and so forth. I think what we've, for a company of our size, it's practically not possible to secure everything, both from the standpoint of keeping the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. When you talk about the good stuff in, or what is of importance or value to us, I think it's very important to identify those aspects of data that are critical to a given business model, and put all your weight and might behind securing that. For example, some types of data that is very important to us is, for example, our R&D information that we consider as IP, and we go to extreme lengths to secure that. Other is simply mandated by legislation, which is the statutory kind of data security that is required, driven by regulations like UPSI, etc., etc. So I think it's important to identify what's important and ring fence that a whole lot more securely, rather than try and apply the same brush across everything, all data that exists in the enterprise. Yes, it's important from a brand protection perspective. We have a number of brands, and given the number of the proliferation of social media today, we often find that the brands get encroached on, and we have mechanisms to pick that up and take them down as well. But that's an ongoing thing, but that's a risk that continues to grow as the social media proliferates and reaches more and more users as well. From the keeping the bad stuff out perspective, I think there's a couple of things that we've identified. Email we've identified as one of the vectors where most of these attacks today originate from. Our own internal statistic shows us that only 10% of the emails that we actually receive are required. Everything else is unnecessary and can be dropped at the email gateway itself. So tightening the security around that, etc., is very important. We treat ransomware as a very high priority from both a prevention and a response standpoint. We recognize that it's not an IT job to just respond to a ransomware type of incident, and it needs a whole lot of involvement from others in the organization, the legal organization, the corporate communications, HR, everyone as a whole set of people that need to know how to respond. So our going in thinking has always been not if, but when will we be attacked and how we will respond. So prevention, detection, and response. Those have been the three pillars of our strategy from securing perspective. I don't know if I've answered the question or.
Okay, I get your point, but let me also now try and get Kapil in and get a sense from him, because, some of the, if we get into just the initial compliances and documentation part, once that is adhered to, Kapil, some things can still go wrong. And again, I get back to the point that, some of the work that you are doing is very critical in nature, and, that cannot be stopped. Give us a sense of what could be this slip between the cup and the lip.
Okay. Ashutosh, whenever we talk for preparation, so there are a lot of things you have to look into from the technical aspect. It's not only documentation. First of all, you have to look how much your employees are aware about cyber attacks, right? For example, the phishing attacks. So every company is facing this problem. One day and another day, you must be getting so many spam mails in your inboxes. So what I feel is 90% cyber attacks we can stop if your employees are aware. 90% attacks we can eliminate at 0 day itself, right? If they not click, no malware, no ransomware get installed or download, right? So you can avoid it. So awareness, I feel, is first before moving towards the documentation or any kind of preparation. Second thing is classification of data business-wise is more important. What is important? What is critical for you? You should be very aware. IT cannot tell ever, right? It's a business decision. Business will tell you what is important for them, what is critical for them, what data we have to secure. Everything you can't secure. You cannot 100% protect your organization, right? So you have to start, you have to build a culture and build a bigger roadmap for the next 5 years, and then you can protect. Third thing is plan. You have to have the plan in place. That's very important. If you don't have any plan to fight with anything, you cannot win the war. So you have to build a plan. So let's say there are 20 things in your bucket, but what is your plan? How you are going to, first of all, pick up 3 important tasks and build a roadmap and execute it. Then go for the budget, right? Because if you have 20 things in your bucket, no board will approve. Your project will never kick off. They will not entertain you. So you have to build the budget. And then the last thing you have to look in the risk audit. How big your organization, and you have to scan entire organization and find out the risk score of your organization. Once you get the risk score of your organization, then you easily can defend yourself. Sure. And last thing I would say, everyone should have the recovery plan. That is very, very important document. If you don't have recovery plan, whatever you are planning, awareness, classification, plan, budget, everything is waste. Because once the attack happened, post all these measures, you cannot basically win the war because you can't recover. So many organizations facing, you talk about the Indian ransom attacks, recent past, right? They took a lot of time for the recovery because they were not prepared for the backup, right? And they were not having very right incident recovery plan. And last thing I would say, we are talking so much about the ransom. Ransom is the goodbye note of any hacker. Why the goodbye reason is because hacker was there in your system from long time. He was basically acting, and he was passing the data in their servers. When he passed all the data from their server, then they are installing ransomware, and they are sending you the goodbye note. Okay, your data is encrypted. If you need the key or you need backup, contact us. The ransom is never is the first first instance. Ransom is the last instance of the hacker. Over to you.
Okay, get the point. John, you wanted to make a point there, but if I can also add to the point that Kapil made about the culture in the organization around security. It is a behavioral change that we're talking about, not just change after an instance. So if you can, if possible, you can also refer to that, John.
That's exactly what I was going to make a point on. Okay. I was going to pick up on that first point from Kapil. The awareness piece needs to be broadened to what you just said, to a security culture within the organization. Being aware of not clicking on phishing emails, that's great. But what else? How else do we behave securely within an organization? And so building a security culture within your organization is so important. And it means more than just having awareness of security. It also means at what layers of the company how do we behave securely at the different layers? So from the CEO on down to the loading dock worker, everybody needs to know how their specific role can impact negatively or positively the security of the company, and how a little slip up here and there could also have dramatic impacts on the organization. So the awareness piece needs to be tailored to the different roles within the company. You can't just blanket say, for some things like email, yes, of course, you can say like, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to look out for. But then there's other things that some of these groups might be responsible for. So a good one that comes to mind for things like finance is when somebody calls you up and says, hey, by the way, we're supplier so-and-so, and we've just changed our banking details to this new bank. Can you please change that in your system? Well, there needs to be a process in place to independently verify whether that information is true or not, because we're seeing this business email compromise type scam, this financial fraud type scams are happening all the time as well. So that is specific to one group. The person in sales is not necessarily going to get that phone call. So establishing a security culture, knowing that everybody within the organization, I call that part of the virtual IT security team, right? Everybody is part of the IT security team and is doing their part to make sure that the organization maintains a safe and secure posture. And one last little thing, it's whatever lessons you learn within the organization, take those home as well. Friends, family, people you talk to, help them stay more secure, because the more difficult we make it for cyber criminals to impact not only organizations, but people in their personal lives, the harder they're going to have to work to actually be successful. Right now, it's a little too easy.
Okay, very interesting point. And just reminds me of, the old saying, prevention is better than cure. And I guess that sums up probably the mood. Before we come to you, Munjal, just give me 1 minute. And, I just wanted to put up another poll with you. You saw the kind of responses the first one got, and that's the poll before you. Security for your enterprise is driven by, and you have those 4 choices: business continuity, digitizing data security, preparing for any eventuality, or are there other factors as well? So please do put in your comments, put in your choices, and we'd love to see what you think of it. Last time, it was a very impromptu and interesting input by you. So we'll wait for your responses, and we'll put up the response to that poll in just a bit and wait for you to answer as we put up the results there. Munjal, you were making a point, please.
Yeah, I just realized we could not vote as panelists.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the point I wanted to make was this actually good to hear these thoughts. So one of the, when it comes to supply chain, right, just wanted to put some light on, what are the, one key step in this whole exercise, right? I think all of these aspects about being aware of information security and the controls that both the organization implements or the third party implements, the vendor implement are important. One key aspect that is really upstream and that adds a lot of value for organizations who, especially which have a lot of third parties and vendors involved in their operations is the entire part on risk profiling. See, no matter what we think and what we say, right, no organization has unlimited resources, time, money, people to do and cover all the third parties. And there's just simply too many of them. The key aspect we've seen is that other than having an inventory of third parties, is also performing the risk profiling from an information security or a cyber perspective, so that the organization really understands, right, how much of risks vests with which third party. And correspondingly, you want to spend your money wherever you get the maximum return on investment. So you really want to focus on the risky third parties first and most, and then pay lesser amount of attention to third parties who can have a more limited impact, even if they're compromised, right, on your business operations. So this part on risk profiling is very important, because everything else that follows that, be it the assessment, be it the controls implementation, and so on and so forth, will follow that activity. So this upstream activity, typically, which is step 2 within your third-party risk management process, is very important, because that understanding needs to be within the organization as well as the business stakeholders as to what risk each third party can pose to the organization, and then correspondingly, you want to evolve your risk management mechanism. Because what we've seen is that once you go beyond your, the Pareto rule, right, about 20% of your vendors or third parties, the rest of them are really smaller organizations, and they pose a very limited amount of risk. And you actually don't want to spend too much of time with them. You really want to understand who are those top 20% first, right? So that's just the point on that, how to optimize your investment.
Okay. Sakshi, any, from a practitioner's point of view, we heard from Munjal the way they've learned from a large number of companies, but from a practitioner's point of view, how would you prioritize, focusing on the big suppliers and some of those smaller ones? How do you do that?
So definitely, we will start obviously from the large suppliers, from the big suppliers. And I think the key will be to, make sure the contracts are really strong in terms of, the security requirements are built into every RFP and contract. So there are requirements for all vendors, and then there are special requirements for the very big vendors, and it kind of goes on from there. So some of the requirements that would be across all kinds of vendors is around, including security requirements in a very standard format across all markets or across all international markets in, every contract and RFP as well. And then, when a vendor is accepted, so I think this journey begins before a vendor is actually coming on board. It starts with the RFP, then goes to the contract. And when the vendor is, kind of accepted in the formal supply chain, that's when the security team should start working with them with, on-site, to address any vulnerabilities that are existing or any security gaps that are existing. And, because, there's one strike and you're out of the system. So the policies with respect to vendor products, that do not match the specifications should be very stringent. So I think very tight controls are required on the approval of vendors and, the pre-qualified vendors, also the cycle of when this should be done over and over again, this kind of an assessment. So, so that's also very important. Making sure, when it comes to IT related vendors, the source code is obtained for any kind of software that is purchased. So these kind of, I think, controls are very important for across all. And then definitely, yes, we should focus on the top vendors.
Okay. John, from your experience, where are the biggest mistakes that happen when we're looking at the security for the extended supply chain? What are some of those most common mistakes that you hear? And, when you look at them, sometimes you say, how could somebody make that mistake?
So I think some of the mistakes, Sakshi was just talking about onboarding processes for vendors, right? Some companies just simply don't do that. They'll just trust that the other vendor has done everything they can to be secure, or their partner has done everything they can. There's an old saying in security, right? Trust but verify. So trust that what they say they are doing, and then verify that whether it's yourself or independently, that they are in fact meeting a certain level of security. And it's all about managing risk, as we've, I think, alluded to many times during this discussion. So you need to understand what risk they represent to your supply chain. Now, I would flip that script a little bit and say, you need to be prepared to do that as well, because you're going to be part of somebody else's supply chain. There's a chance that that's going to happen. So understand what your risks are, what risks you pose, and how you're going to mitigate those risks and present those to any organizations that ask for it. There are some other issues that come to mind. So with respect to implementing, let's say, a hardware or software, there are defaults that are not always the best starting point for security, where they've got hard-coded passwords or they've got too permissive defaults. And I think that's part of onboarding is the actual implementation. That's the next step, is understanding what those defaults are. And I think that's where a lot of companies also fall down, is they either don't know about some of these defaults, they don't know about how to configure the software properly or the hardware properly, or how to use the service, and therefore they leave something open or something that is in a maybe less secure state than it could be. So understanding how to use the product, how to use the service is really important as well. It's just it's part of the due diligence that you do when you bring stuff in. And again, Sakshi made a great point of this is a continuous cycle, right? So just because you've done it once doesn't mean you're done. And I also I can't remember, I think it was Kapil that made the point of, the ransomware is the last thing that you see. It's actually the most visible thing, but there's been some other stuff that's happened before that. So all these things are cycles, right? When you see an indicator of something, go threat hunting. When you have a new vendor coming in, don't just do the one piece of due diligence. Keep up to date with them. Ask them if anything's changed. If there's a big turnover in, let's say, senior management, okay, let's figure out what does that mean for that company, and how will their stance change, and how will their product that they're bringing to you change, and potentially change for the worst or for the better. So there's this continuous cycle of assess, test, and reassess and retest going on for all aspects, whether it's the technology you're using, the people that you're bringing into your organization, or the processes that you're putting in place for your organization to deal with a lot of these things.
Okay. Just to remind everyone who's with us, you can post your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll be happy to answer. And we've been getting some of them, and they've been answered as well. So let me now, as we wait for your questions, so we'll also come to you with another poll in just a bit. So let me first go to Mayur and ask about what's the road ahead, because that is also, things are getting a little more complex, a little more challenging with every passing day. There are new tricks being played by a bunch of hackers or whoever they are, and they're adopting newer strategies. How do you stay abreast, Mayur? Can you sleep easily at night?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Yeah, but I'll make an attempt. I think our response, and all the panelists have spoken about that, our response really needs to focus around people, process, and technology. It cannot be one or either of these three. There is a significant amount of investment that we have identified, and that is going into technology and the various tools that need to get deployed, particularly in light of the increased number of threat vectors, in light of the expanding perimeter. I think a year and a half ago we were talking about largely office-based access and maybe some access from the field, etc., from the sales force, etc. Now I think every device that's connecting to our organization, whether it's through an internal employee or a vendor or a customer, is all part of our extended perimeter, and the number of tools that you're going to need is obviously going to go up. So the investments on technology are very much there. I think there was a very valid point on awareness. I think a first line of defense is the people. Anything and everything typically originates from somebody clicking on something, right? And hence the awareness that needs to get built there. That's a fairly ongoing thing that we routinely run, we routinely invest in. People change, threats change, the landscape changes, so it needs to constantly evolve. It needs to constantly get hammered in, so to speak, so that it becomes part of the organizational DNA. The last thing, of course, is the process, and again we've spoken about that. tightening governance processes, knowing where your data is, deciding who's going to make changes, how are the changes going to be made, all the governance around that, that is important. Lastly, one area of focus for us is responding, and that's where I alluded to a lot of other people that need to get involved in the response, including supply chain, HR, corporate communications, finance, legal, and so on and so forth. Response has several facets to it. And we have been indulging in these tabletop kind of exercises to simulate our response. A journey to the cloud continues, and that helps us from additional backups and security of data as well. So the built-in protection that comes with leading cloud providers is something that we've been leveraging quite a bit. So fair amount of work has gone into it, but there is, so to speak, miles to go before we sleep.
Okay, that's a very interesting one to end your answer with on that question. Sakshi, you've raised your hand, but since Mayur mentioned about the cloud, that's what our next poll is also about. So we'll bring you that poll as well, and we'd want your answers there. There goes the poll. What form of cloud has your business opted for in recent years? And those are the four options for you. Public cloud? Is it a private cloud? Are you looking at a multi-cloud, or have you chosen a hybrid cloud? So we'll put up the results to the poll as well, even as I go to Sakshi and ask her the point that she wants to make. Sakshi.
Sure. I was just going to add, to my co-panelist has raised the right points, but I just like to say that, we are operating in a new normal today. And we are a transformed cybersecurity function in terms of, we are a new business reality today. So what's important is for cybersecurity to be a business advisor and, a transformation enabler. You were talking about, what lies ahead. So I feel like, the cybersecurity strategy and roadmaps, they've been realigned. The cybersecurity governance management and operational structures have got realigned. I think the risk assessment methodologies have got completely revised. I mean, I'm saying being for the last 2 decades into this line, I can see that, how we are kind of, the way we are monitoring and evaluating the security KPIs has got transformed. So it's a very interesting space to be in, and the new normal is totally transformed.
Okay, so the poll results, and these are instant poll results. So that is also with you on the screen. So hybrid cloud, more than 50% of people or the respondents have a comment or have opted for, looks like, a hybrid cloud. So this is a small audience, but this gives you a dipstick into what it is like. Okay, let me go to John before I come to Kapil as well. John, in terms of this complexity that you see, how does one choose the right partner to ensure your security policies are executed? Well, with the intent where the board has finalized it, or the topmost people have finalized it, and also with the right earnest at the execution level.
So I think in terms of choosing the right partner, it's understanding that, well, it's finding and understanding that partner is able to meet your needs, right? So you'll have some requirements at the outset of what that is, whether it's a service or a product. They can meet your needs, that they are that they share your, let's call it, passion for security, that they share your awareness, that they share the importance that you place on security for not only your organization but their organization as well. It's kind of like trying to, when you're looking for partners, you want partners that are really looking in the same direction you are and are trying to achieve the same goals. And you can only do that, as Sakshi was pointing out earlier, with auditing these vendors, these services, these service providers, and being able to understand where they sit. So going forward, I think as you're planning to take on new vendors, as you're planning to consume new services, you shouldn't be afraid to ask some what might be difficult questions of these vendors and say, how do you address a certain how do you address a ransomware attack? Even just asking that question and having them walk you through what their plans are. The first red flag should be, oh, well, we've got some good technology that'll take care of it for us. Well, no, you need to have a plan, right? Everybody needs to have a plan. So if they have a plan, have them walk you through that, and it'll give you a sense for the importance that they place on their security, which in turn should give you an idea of how they would treat your security as well.
Okay. We have a question on supply chain, and I'd like to, Kapil, if you could take that, please. The name's not mentioned here, but the question goes, which risk frameworks can be implemented in supply chain in order to ensure a safe work environment? Kapil.
Yeah. First of all, you should not directly look for the framework, because there are a lot of frameworks are available. You have to look for your business and the requirement first. I can say right now the best framework which is available across is NIST framework. Everybody is looking for it, right? But there are specific frameworks are there which is focusing on a supply chain. So you have, if you are manufacturing company and dealing in a supply chain, so for you there are better than frameworks are available if you compare with the NIST. Coming to the, what's your question, Ashutosh, for me?
So the question was, this was a question from the audience, and that's what, I'll just read out the question again. It says, which risk framework, so since you've mentioned, you may, if you want to just put a little context to it, which risk frameworks, it went, can be implemented in supply chain in order to ensure a safe work environment?
All right. So as I said, like framework you can choose as per your business need. And another thing is what you have to focus on is like whenever we look for any framework. So first of all, certain things you have to work on it, like you have to do the profiling of any vendor. What kind of vendor are you looking for? Because framework is set of processes which you have to follow, but you have to do a lot of onboarding and then execution as well. So the first point is the profiling. You have to choose the right partner, and to go for the right partner, couple of things you have to keep in the mind as per the framework. First thing is the compliance expertise. Whenever we are building a process, so you have to check that how flexible that person is, because people say like they follow the compliances, but they don't. So how you will ensure about that? You have to ask for a couple of certification, like SOC certification if he has, or ISO certification he has, or some of the cybersecurity certification he has, right? Such kind of certification you should verify, and it's very easy. Take the number, go to the site and check. This kind of due diligence you have to do. You should not believe on them something he has given to you and you are okay with that. You should not. So second thing, what you have to, how good he is about the managed services. If we are giving any managed services like software, hardware, infrastructure, cloud, whatever managed services we are offering, so you have to, and everything falls in a bucket of the whatever the framework you are using. If I'll take the example of a NIST framework, so there are certain guidelines which you have to follow step by step. What I'm telling you.
Got it.
Third thing is technical expertise. How good they are. I mean, for which job I'm hiring, because every vendor, what in my experience is, they will say, sir, I can do that. I have 20 customers like this, right? But when you give the job, you will find this is the first time he's doing it. He's hiring for you, right?
Okay.
So you have to basically go for the references check and all other things you have to do. And the important point is how serious he is about supply chain vulnerability. Every vendor says, this is not my part, this is not my responsibility. They will cover in the agreement. Sir, this is your data. I'm doing only job. You are paying me for that. I'm not responsible for any vulnerability attack or any kind of incident happen at your site. Everything is your baby. Please immediately drop that vendor if he's not set of owning your responsibility. Because any kind of, and what NIST says is, your partner is you should not treat partner as a partner, because he is your business partner actually, right? He's developing a workflows for you so that you can basically have the structured data in place and do the analytics over on that. You can run this next layer of next set of the business over on that. If you don't have the right partner, which is denying in a first stance, right?
Got it.
That's not a right partner. So
Okay.
that those kind of things you have to follow from the any framework.
Okay. So there's another question from Prathamesh Kulkarni, and the question is pretty broad. So I'll try and give it maybe a focus. How should MSMEs plan their cybersecurity journey? So Munjal, maybe not as broad as that, but for a lot of Indian companies, because as you have the Amazons, the Walmarts coming, you have a lot of smaller, relatively smaller companies which are selling to global markets. How should these relatively smaller companies look at their supply chain and the security around it so that tomorrow they are not faced with one of the difficult situations?
Sure. Thanks, Ashutosh. And actually, I'll answer this question, part of it also to enhance what Kapil said. Right, the typical framework, I was trying to actually paste a diagram on that, but I can only put in text. I can't put diagrams on the chat box. Okay. But basically, the risk management framework for third parties or vendors, right, follows the vendor's life cycle as well, which starts with vendor evaluation, selection, onboarding, and termination at some point in time, right? Typically, the framework follows that as well. Now, for MSMEs, you're right. I think the crux is that, as I mentioned, right, beyond 20% are small to medium organizations that provide services, especially in the Indian context, right? Now, however, I wouldn't rate risk to the size of the organization because it's really dependent on the type of work that or the service that the organization is providing. So, for example, even if a bank engages a 1,000-member call center that works on a virtual desktop environment, the risk is not immense. However, if a small team of 20 professionals are providing treasury management services, it's a high-risk area for a bank because the volume of the transaction value is very high, right? So risk is really not linked to size. Therefore, MSMEs also have to be very conversant and aware of the risk they could pose to their clients, right? Now, I would largely divide for MSMEs and the challenges they have in engaging with large global organizations, right? In terms of doing a lot of compliance, a lot of paperwork, which is practically difficult, right? I would broadly divide into two areas based on the experience of what we've seen with our clients. One is get the basic fundamentals right, regardless of your client, which means as the other co-panelists mentioned, some amount of security training, certification for your employees, right? Having an assessment of your own suppliers who provide services to you, right? And also being able to profile the sort of information that you receive from your clients. These are basic fundamental building blocks that you should build in. There are 3 or 4 areas where I would suggest that be it large or small or medium organizations, they need to pay more attention. The first is access control, right? When you are accessing your client systems, right? Make sure that you insist and you get role-based access control. Don't look for generic IDs because it's convenient for you to configure them on your system because you need to follow the zero trust approach, right? So first is access control. Second, along with access control, I would add multi-factor authentication, especially when you're providing privileged role-based access to your client systems. When you're doing database management, database activity monitoring, any type of security work for your clients, make sure that you build in multi-factor authentication along with your client for any privileged roles. Third is the incident guides, right? I think maybe Kapil mentioned it when he spoke or Mayur did, right? At least along with your clients, have some sort of a red teaming tabletop exercise where in case you have a security incident, and as all of us know, it's only when rather than if a security incident is going to happen. How would you respond to such an incident? Whom do you reach out to in your client's organization? Whom do you intimate, right? In what format or what details and so on and so forth. If MSMEs even take these 3 or 4 steps, they'll be very effective in increasing the trust levels with their clients and therefore also increasing the business with their clients.
Mayur?
I like to add.
Sure.
So whenever we talk for the MSME, I'm giving you a typical example of any startup, right? And if let's say somebody's talking about cybersecurity, and very good, like you are a startup company and talking about cybersecurity, building a product which is not launched, or maybe a couple of clients you have. So in this scenario, see, typically how you basically go for it. So as per, like, there are certain compliances where they say 6% of revenue you have to invest on the cybersecurity side, right? What is your revenue as a startup? Are you ready to invest 6% of that cost? You will not get anything because your revenue is very less in that case. So it is a need, because if you want more contracts, so now these days everybody, we talked just 5-10 minutes back, like there are a lot of due diligences people are doing. Is if Sakshi is a tough client, right, then she will ask 1,000 certificates from you as a startup. So it's a need. You should not look for the budget. You should not wait for anything, anybody, or Munjal said going to say, okay, you do that, right? No, you don't need consulting. It is a requirement now. It is a requirement because we are in a digital era. Forget about everything. Go with the zero. Create your own budget. Create a roadmap. Like next 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, you will get this certification because you need more business actually.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so there's another question. So Mayur, I wanted you to probably try and answer that. Okay, it begins with an opinion, which says, in my opinion, nothing is 100% safe, even after any level of security we may implement. Okay, that's opinion. We can keep that aside. Well, what are the top 3 to 5 things Mayank Srivastav says to do to increase this time? And he's referring to, we can just increase the time of compromising by enhancing the security. He means to say, probably make it more difficult, as I understand. Mayur, would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I agree. There is nothing like foolproof security. It exists only in the theoretical utopian world. The simple analogy that I like to give is that of the lock on your front door. Now, if you can either choose to lock the door or leave the door open, or put an expensive lock which requires biometric authentication, etc., etc. All of those locks can be picked by somebody who's skilled at picking locks, right? There is nothing like a pick-proof lock. The only thing you want to do is to make sure that your door is not or your lock is not the easiest lock to pick on the block. So you want to put up a reasonable amount of barriers to make sure that you are not a sitting duck. You are not the easiest target around. And I think our eventual approach has to be towards doing that. The other point that I think was made in the question is this just about increasing the time till you get compromised or attacked, etc.? I think it's not just about increasing. It is about reducing the probability, which is what the lock is doing. It's also preparing you to respond and recover from the attack. So there is, like I said earlier, there is a component of prevention. There is a component of detection. So prevention is doing everything that you can to make sure it doesn't happen. Make sure you've got a reasonable lock in place. Make sure people know how to operate the lock, etc., etc. Make sure that people do use the lock. And that's all about awareness and so on and so forth. Then there is detection, which tells you when the lock has been breached, and the third is about remediation and recovering from the attack. So I think the strategy has to be the emphasis has to be on all three, and there is a definite amount of value in putting your focus, your investments, and your budgets in all of the three buckets, not in one or the other.
Okay, so remedial measures. So since you mentioned about remedial measures, Mayur, let me take that question and, really about what some of those, the malware recovery plan that you must have as a company. Sakshi, would you like to take that? What should be the essential elements to that? And I'll come to others as well on that question.
No, sure. I'd like to start by saying that, yes, it's an important thing that, we should develop our defenses with the, basis on the principle that, your systems will be breached. And when one starts with that premise that, a breach is inevitable, it changes the decision matrix on the next steps. And this, brings up the this brings up the point that, we need to have a proactive approach, and preparation is key, because, ransomware attacks will typically strike without a warning, and, they leave the targeted organization in a very, high stake recovery challenges. So I think the speed and the effectiveness of recovery can have critical implications for both the organization and also the end customers. So to recover quickly and to mitigate the damage caused by an attack, I think the organizations should design and implement a very proactive as well as tactical approaches to the recovery. And this should include very specific methodologies to capture, to protect, and to restore the mission critical data assets. So I completely focus on the point of having a very proactive approach to recovery, the planning for recovery.
John, malware recovery plan, would you like to suggest maybe some of the steps that you have to and necessarily must follow? And of course, some of the details of that, please.
Sure. So part of being able to recover from an incident is having data and information to support your activities. And in order to do that, you need to be able to instrument your organization to be able to capture all of that data. So, all too often in some of the rapid response engagements that we participate in, we find that the reason for a breach was because an organization didn't have visibility into an area of their network, and therefore that's where the bad guys got in and were able to sort of sit and do all of their nefarious activities from. Or there was something like the servers weren't protected, right? So not only does a lack of protection obviously have a security context to it, but the fact that there's no visibility coming from those servers as well is important. And so having that visibility allows you to then make better decisions about, well, what else, or how big is the impact, right? So if 100 endpoints get encrypted, well, what else has been touched within the organization? Have the file servers been touched and has data been stolen? Or if it's, let's say, even let's get away from ransomware for a second and talk about crypto miners, right? Which of my machines have crypto miners running on them, right? You're going to need to be able to answer those questions. And part of your response then also includes things, and I think Mayur touched on these before, which is, who do you need to call, right? Do you need to call your legal team? Do you need to call obviously you got to, the executive management team needs to be involved. But there are other people as well. So corporate communications, right? Your support organization. So let's say you're a services organization. Some of your customers might be calling you, asking you what's going on with your service. Why is it down today? You need to have an effective communication strategy, not only a proactive one with your corporate communications, but a reactive one with your support organization. And that's all part of having a plan, having a defined set of activities that occur within each group within the company, and knowing that each group has their playbook of what they need to do is just absolutely important to a recovery.
Okay, Munjal, I come back to that 1200 number. I'm still very enamored by that 1200 number. Was there anything that they had to say about malware recovery plan? Did respondents answer any of those questions?
Really, in terms of incidents, so what we saw, one of the things that we got from the survey was that previously, the maximum damage or the financial loss due to third-party incidents was plateauing in the level of $100 million. And this is 6th year of the survey. So just for reference, right? I'm talking about survey in 2019 and 2020. And in 2021, there were 19% of our respondents who said that they would attribute a loss of between $500 million to $1 billion due to a third-party incident. Right? Just to give you a context of the sort of losses that organizations face in terms of disruption, maybe legal charges, disruption to IT, recovery of data, so on and so forth, right? So it definitely has increased in prominence and its impact, third-party incidents, cyber incidents on organizations, especially large global ones. So that is one data point. And the second part is also that organizations have indicated that they're increasing their investments, right, by up to 40% on managing third-party incidents and incident response when it comes to third parties specifically. Otherwise, organizations were very geared to performing incident response and identifying as well as responding to incidents and recovering, which were more internal focusing. What if my organization was directly under attack, a denial of service, and so on and so forth? What would we do, right? However, that focus has also changed to what they would do when one of the partners or the alliances or a supplier is impacted, and then that creates a backdoor into their own organization, right? So these are some aspects that I would highlight from this.
Sure. So Mayur, you raised a hand. I missed that. If you'd like to add your point, please. Before
I just wanted to add one point. Point I wanted to add is when you have all these recovery plans in place, but when everything fails, there's always insurance. And I think cyber insurance needs to be an essential part of any recovery. The insurance plans on the market today cover all kinds of situations: frauds, cybercrime, attacks, even costs on forensics, and all of that. And I think that needs to be looked upon as an investment and integrated into recovery and remediation and recovery plans and costs.
Sure. Kapil, the nature again of the business also decides the kind of recovery plan that you'll have. What will you say about the malware recovery for the supply chain and to enhance it through the way it is increasing as well, keeping in mind the way it is increasing?
Ashutosh says because the way vectors are growing, so we have to follow, every organization has to follow a 3-to-1 rule of backup. Means you have to have, if organization can afford, so they can basically have a 3 copy of the backups. If organization can afford, at least they have to maintain 2 copy of the backup in different territories, different zone. Or if you're not, at least maintain a 1 copy of the backup. So this is up to you, up to your pocket. That's rule number 1. Number 2, DR plan. What is your disaster recovery plan? So many people, I've seen it in personal experience. They are going for the cloud. So they say they follow only cloud backup plan. They are not buying like a typical companies asking for their having DR plan, separate DR plan, because it's an investment. You never know. It's happened only one day or maybe 5 years, in the 5 years one time. It's an expense actually. But you should have the DR. You never know when you are going to meet with this objective, because once something happened, any disaster happened, right? Natural disaster, maybe cyber disaster, whatever happened, right? At least you can save your reputation. You can bring back your system faster and your operation supply chain will be on the floor, right? Third thing is recovery assurance immediately to the client. You should not wait, right? Communication has to go to the client. What has happened with you and what are you doing? That's very fair ask. And the last thing what I would say, RTO and RPO. You have to maintain your RTO and RPO, recovery time objectives. How much time you will take to recover it from this? Over to you, Ashutosh.
Okay. Thank you so much. John has raised his hand. John, with short on time, if you can make your point. And of course, you have to do the vote of thanks as well.
Yeah, very quickly to what Mayur said about cyber insurance. I agree. I think that's an important part of your cyber defense. However, be careful when you do get cyber insurance. Really seek to understand what you're covered for and the kinds of things that the insurance company is willing to reimburse you for, because a lot of companies have been caught out by those kinds of things by just blindly going and buying insurance. So really understand what you're getting. So I'll go into the word of thanks now, and I'll briefly summarize, because we're on time, but I'll briefly summarize what everybody was saying, and Mayur kind of read my mind with the PPT, the people, processes, and tools, right? These are all essential pieces of having a robust supply chain. The people, establishing a security culture and understanding how you can keep the organization secure. The processes, how do you go about bringing businesses into the organization? How do you establish a secure footprint within yourselves? And how do you participate in other people's supply chains? And finally, the technologies that you're using, the tools that you're using. Make sure you're using up-to-date modern technologies, because they can do a lot more. A lot of the reasons that some companies are getting broken into these days is because they're prepared to deal with yesterday's threats, not today's threats. And the new tools might be something like a new architecture, and it was touched on a couple times. Zero trust is really one of these things in this new hybrid working model where we've got people everywhere, they're remote, they're cloud, they're local. Zero trust is really something that a lot of organizations should consider going forward to maintain the security of their supply chains. So with that, I'd like to thank all my co-panelists for a great discussion. Our moderator, Ashutosh, thank you very much for moderating the discussion. And really for everybody who attended today, thank you for listening to us. And I hope that everybody took away a little bit something that they can apply to their organizations to stay secure in the future.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you, everyone, for being such a wonderful, engaging discussion. For me, the complexity because of the challenges faced by investments in disaster recovery, we're talking of work from home times, and still we are not in normal times. So, and of course, the point that stays with me, and I'm sure Sakshi will have a smile on her face with that, the integrated digital security approach. It's kind of stuck in my head. So super, thanks so much, Sakshi, for that. And thank you everyone for being with us on this interesting discussion. Of course, we'll get you more and more of these, and we expect you to join in as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.